Welcome everyone to our event this evening, Attack on Education, Lessons for Manitoba. My name is Molly McCracken. I'm the Manitoba Director at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we're very pleased to be hosting this event today. Thank you all for joining us here this evening. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you like. I note that this event is being recorded and is also being live streamed to our YouTube channel. So this will be available to others to view as well. We'll send an email post-event with the details for all of you who registered as well. We are broadcasting today from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The hydroelectricity powering my computer is generated in northern Manitoba, Treaty 5 territory, and the water that sustains me here is from Treaty 3 territory. The water, as treaty people, we have acknowledged the damages of the past and present and commit to working in meaningful partnership with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And certainly the changes that we're seeing here introduced in Manitoba to governance of education, funding, and other steps that have been taken for equity for First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis people are being critiqued as a step back towards truth and reconciliation by Indigenous leaders here in Manitoba. So there is a link between my land acknowledgement and our event here today, obviously. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of our event tonight, to CUPE Manitoba, to the Manitoba Government Employees Union, to the Teachers Society, the Manitoba Teachers Society, UFCW 832, and the Winnipeg Labour Council. Thank you so much to our Labour partners for supporting this event this evening. I also want to thank everybody behind the scenes. We have Adnan Farouk, who is our tech host this evening. Thanks so much for helping us make this event possible. And thank you, of course, to our esteemed panelists and Erika Shaker, who I'll be introducing briefly. The public interest here in education is extremely high right now. Many people are feeling that we are under assault, under attack, as during COVID, we're dealing with a huge overhaul of our education system by an austerity-driven government. And this long-awaited K-12 education review was released just last March. It was critiqued along the way for its process, but when it was finally released, it was done so along with new legislation that eliminates local democratic oversight of education, the elimination of school boards here in Manitoba, and other aspects of the legislation, as James Bedford will go over, are also of concern to many involved in the school system and a concern for a healthy public education system here in Manitoba. So we're very lucky that we have folks from other places in Canada with us tonight. That is one of the wonderful things about the new Zoom reality, is we can have these events across the country to share with us how they've responded and what they're doing, and to give us some inspiration and ideas for our work here in Manitoba. I'm just going to go over our agenda, and then we'll begin here. The first panelist this evening is James Bedford, who's president of the Manitoba Teachers Society, and he's going to give a presentation on the new Manitoba legislation. Then we're going to hear from experts across the country about the impacts of similar changes in their jurisdictions and how they organized in response. We're going to hear from Paul Wozney, president of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Archie Beals, who's former elected African Nova Scotian representative of the Halifax School Board and current appointee to the Provincial Advisory Council on Education in Nova Scotia. Then next from Moussa Kadri, who's a member of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation and involved in another group she'll speak about there in Ontario. And then from Medina Musa, Executive Director of Supporting Our Students, Alberta. And then we'll have some time for questions and discussion with those of you who are joining us in the audience here this evening. If you have questions, please put them in the chat at any time along the way, and we'll be pulling questions out of the chat along the way. So before we start with our panelists, I'm so pleased that my colleague Erika Shaker is here from the CCPA National Office. She is the director of CCPA National and longtime editor of the progressive CCPA publication, Our Schools Ourselves. So Erika will be giving some introductory remarks to set the context on the neoliberal project as it relates to education in Canada. Over to you, Erika, in Ottawa.
Thank you so much, Molly. Thanks to my fellow panelists, and thank you to all of you who have joined us today. It's a pleasure to be joining you tonight from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Thanks so much for having me here. I don't usually do this when talking about the importance of public education, but I'm actually going to start off with a quote by a libertarian, Milton Friedman. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Well, our landscape is littered with bad neoliberal ideas that have been accumulating for decades, disproven and very dangerous, and yet they refuse to die. Instead, at key moments, they're resuscitated, given a bit of a makeover, and then reintroduced, perhaps with a slightly different name or in a slightly different jurisdiction. None of this is happening by accident or is happening absent of context. As a direct result of fiscal and structural changes that really took off in the mid-90s, inequality began to climb. And as a result, more people are now trapped in precarious work without benefits or job security, many without paid sick leave, and that is a huge issue right now, with no sense of whether they will be working at the same job a year from now. In addition to financial implications, of course, there's other evidence of how insecurity and precarity has changed, fundamentally changed how we socialize, and how communities, families, and personal relationships work, or really if they work at all. So we are talking about social regression at a very basic level. And of course, this was all pre-COVID, which has precipitated unprecedented, I know we've heard that word a lot, but unprecedented disruption to an already deeply inequitable and precarious system. It is a very vicious cycle. Austerity is promoted as the cure for our overly entitled ways. Public services like our schools are made responsible for all the human casualties and are blamed for not gracefully making do with their systemically underfunded infrastructure, or for failing to completely fix inequality or poverty or any number of other social problems exacerbated by or even created by austerity in the first place. But rather than taking stock of where we're at and how we got here, more austerity, masquerading as accountability or responsibility or any other number of euphemisms, is touted as the solution to ensure our schools are running efficiently, doing more with less, hustling to provide that little extra to attract prospective clients and increase market share or client share, demonstrating a return on investment and churning out future workers who confuse citizen with taxpayer and critical thinking with earning a living. Schools reflect what happens when society becomes more unequal. The kids who come to school hungry, the parents who would desperately love to, but simply can't help with homework sufficiently or attend school meetings because they're catching up on sleep after another double shift, or because language supports are unavailable. The lack of public money for educational enhancements like gym equipment or library books or school supplies, or in some cases, even functioning water fountains or leaky roofs, elevated stress levels, the emotional pain that teachers and education workers and parents and students across the system deal with or internalize every day. Here's the thing. We know that standardized testing is a punishing, intrusive, and deeply flawed method of assessing how public education is meeting the very non-standardized needs of kids. But it is also an extremely accurate measurement for demonstrating which kids and which communities and which schools our political and economic priorities have marginalized, brutalized, and let down. However, instead, test scores are weaponized as evidence that schools and the people in them are failing kids, when the real culprit is what our elected leaders choose to prioritize. It's always much easier and politically expedient to blame workers and unions, or in some cases, indulgent parents or disaffected kids for being obstructionist or entitled or unrealistic. The solutions to so-called failing schools, as determined through test scores or any number of reviews or expert panels, and we'll be talking about that tonight, are almost always market-based, whether it's saving money through privatizing service delivery or the infrastructure of the school itself through P3s or other alternative funding methods, or a more individualized voucher-like approach to funding, curriculum redesign, accountability, and expectations. The customer always right pedagogy is certainly not about authentic community engagement or public participation. Eliminating school boards or reducing school boards and replacing trustees with volunteers or a 1-800 number for parents in the name of efficiency is a deeply cynical, anti-democratic move. As a result, while properly funded, accessible, and publicly accountable schools are frequently in the best position to help overcome widening socioeconomic inequities, the neoliberal bookends of underfunding and privatization will always reinforce those inequities, blaming schools, educators, and education workers, and sometimes entire communities in the process. We all pay the price for that, but the kids who are most vulnerable will, as always, pay most dearly. We are at a critical juncture. The impacts of the shutdown, and then the reopening, and then the shutdown, and then the vaccine rollout have exposed a number, but I'm going to focus on 3 major obstacles to progress. 1, many of the income support and other systems we depend on have not adapted to reflect current economic, societal, and labor market realities. 2, decades of cuts have reduced capacity, infrastructure integrity, and the ability of our systems to respond well to even non-pandemic needs and requirements. And 3, both of these trends have further entrenched existing inequity and systemic oppressions with impacts disproportionately experienced by already marginalized communities. And this is why back to normal simply isn't an option. Inaccessibility, inequity, systemic racism, settler colonialism, and injustice didn't just happen, and let's hope we didn't just notice them now. Like so many community institutions, our public schools are at the nexus of these forces: community need, systemic underfunding in the context of a broader austerity agenda, and the continued prioritizing of market-based solutions. But we are also at a moment when we have been reminded of what is possible when we collectively demand better. We are also in a position to learn from each other's experiences, because as relentless as these attacks on public education, and in fact, our entire public services and our public infrastructure are, they are not at all original. We can still regain control of the debate because we are seeing in real time the abject failure of a market-based response to the public solutions we demand. I am really looking forward to sharing strategies and experiences by allies who have been on the front lines of the education debates, on the picket lines, in the classrooms, and on the streets. To my fellow panelists, I'm honored to be here with you tonight. And Molly, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this evening.
Thank you so much, Erika, for those opening comments and for getting us started off tonight. And if you just joined us, welcome. We have about 170 people here, and we're so glad you can be here tonight in Winnipeg here. It's a beautiful day after a long day of cloudy, not so warm days. So thanks for spending your evening with us. And I also see we have somebody from Yellowknife. That's fantastic. And thanks for introducing yourselves in the chat here. We have wonderful array of people, of teachers, of school trustees, faculty, somebody from the newcomer serving community, the Needs Center, labor leaders, and Parents for Public Education here in Manitoba. That's fantastic. I also want to acknowledge we have Dougal Lamont, the leader of the Manitoba Liberals. Thanks for coming tonight, Dougal, and Nello Altamar, the education critic with the Manitoba NDP. Thanks for being here as well. So now I'm going to introduce James Bedford, who's the president of the Manitoba Teachers Society, to give us a presentation on Bill 64, the Education Modernization Act. So over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Molly. Let me just begin my slideshow here. And there we go. So welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. The Manitoba Teachers Society is very proud to be a longtime supporter of CCPA and also in wonderful company tonight in terms of sponsoring this event. It is so reassuring to see so many of our labor partners joining with us in sponsoring this event and joining with us in advocacy literally about the future of public education in the province, the future of our children, and quite frankly, the future of the province. I'm going to try really hard to stay to my 15-minute timeline tonight. You see on our first slide our hashtag. I want you to take note of that hashtag because our members are doing an extraordinary job in social media in terms of speaking out on this piece of legislation, in terms of telling their stories. And I very much hope that you and many more voices will join us on this piece of legislation. So getting into Bill 64. Bill 64 is named the Education Modernization Act. A huge misnomer because what Bill 64 does is introduce a governance model for public education that's really reflective of how public schools were governed in the first half of the 20th century, where virtually every school in the province had its own school board. Those individuals, largely male, elected from the community to represent the interests of the community within their schools. I want you to understand that Bill 64 is little more than about the governance of the public school system. It's touted to be a bill that enables the recommendations from the K-12 education review that was conducted in the province more than a year ago. It's a bill that's touted to implement those recommendations, but it really does none of that. And I really encourage the audience tonight, if you haven't looked at the recommendations that have flown from the K-12 education review, I encourage you to do so because there are many, many good recommendations within that report, recommendations that would be good for the students in the province of Manitoba. And that's very much the position that the Manitoba Teachers Society takes, is we are all about improving the public school system in the province of Manitoba to the benefit of the students in our classrooms and to the benefit of those who teach and work in our public school system. So we oppose, the Manitoba Teachers Society opposes Bill 64, and we oppose it for just the reason that I spoke about. When we look at changes for the public school system in the province of Manitoba, we want to look at changes that are going to improve the learning conditions for Manitoba students. And you have maybe heard this expression before, that the learning conditions for students are the working conditions for teachers, or the working conditions for teachers are in fact the learning conditions for students. So what is good for students is good for teachers. Bill 64 is really about partisan politics. It is really about the government wanting to take direct financial control and direct governance control of the public school system within the province of Manitoba. So let's talk a minute about that centralized control. One of the key issues or key aspects of Bill 64 is that it dissolves all 37 English language school boards in the province of Manitoba, and it replaces them with a provincially appointed, a government appointed board to govern all English language schools within the province of Manitoba. The Division Scolaire Franco-Manitoban will maintain its school board because French language education is protected under the Canadian Constitution. So what's the overall impact of this? Well, it actually reduces accountability, particularly reduces governance accountability for school boards. Currently in the province of Manitoba, every adult Manitoban has the right to vote for a school trustee. Those school trustees are directly accountable to the electorate, directly accountable to the communities that represent them. Bill 64 seeks to sever that connection between community and school and governance of schools. So how does it do this? Well, one of the ways that it does it is it really restricts local community voices. Bill 64 replaces, or sort of replaces, school divisions with mega regions throughout the province. Some of the regions in the rural parts of the province mimic geographically what current school divisions are. Other geographic or regions within the province amalgamate school divisions to create enormous entities, the city of Winnipeg being one of them. Nearly half the students in the province of Manitoba attend schools in the city of Winnipeg. Metro Winnipeg will become a single region with a single voice representing that region at a provincial level advisory council. If we look to the northern part of the province, and I was at a town hall virtually in Thompson last night, the entire northern part of the province will become a single region, again, represented by a single voice. Anyone familiar with the North, anyone familiar with the city of Winnipeg knows that the diversity that exists within these regions and a single voice would be hard-pressed, near impossible to represent the diverse viewpoints within that region. Let me talk a little bit more on a localized level. Currently, when a child attends school, they generally attend 3 schools, an elementary, a middle, and a high school. One of the critical roles that school divisions play in public education in this province and elsewhere is they determine programming within the school division, and they also work to make sure schools are working cooperatively with one another. I'll use heritage language programs as an example. The school division I live in, River East Transcona, prides itself in having a German immersion program. Across the river in the Seven Oaks School Division, they pride themselves in having Cree language programs. Indigenous language programs are commonplace throughout the North. For a heritage language program to be successful for a student, that program must be extended across the entire learning of the student. That is, it must begin in the elementary school, continue in the middle school, and conclude at the high school. If school governance falls upon local parent councils to make programming decisions within their schools, you may very well have the instance where a heritage language program is important to those in a middle school, yet the students coming from the elementary school have no such access to a program, therefore no preparation to a program, and the students excited about learning that heritage language may not be able to continue their studies at the high school level. School divisions, school trustees, those professionals who work in school divisions play a critical role in programming to the benefit of children and the benefit of communities in our public schools. Bill 64 also removes those educational experts from decision making. And educational experts work across our existing school division structure, not only from classroom teachers and educational assistants who support them, but through school principals, through coordinators and directors, through superintendents, and up to and including school trustees. Bill 64 calls for parent-led community councils that will have the responsibility for hiring and evaluating staff. They will analyze student achievement. They will analyze learning outcomes. They will make pedagogical decisions for programming within a school. These are all things that educational experts currently undertake. And all of those educational experts, wherever they work in the province, up to and including school trustees, have a mandate to ensure that they are educated, they are prepared, and have ongoing professional development in order to do or fulfill their roles as well as could possibly be expected. No such provisions exist for volunteer parent councils in Bill 64. And our concern is that parents will be put into an impossible position, making critical decisions for a public school system that they are ill prepared to make and ill supported to continue making. Erika Shaker has spoken well about some of the socioeconomic factors that impact student outcomes. Within the province of Manitoba, we have some of the highest rates of childhood poverty within the country. If you go back to the recommendations that flowed from the K-12 education review, you will see recommendations that will specifically address childhood poverty in the province of Manitoba. Erika spoke extraordinarily well about some of the impacts that poverty has on our public education system. Bill 64 completely ignores those socioeconomic factors affecting student outcomes. We had high expectations that this government would address the issue of student poverty head on, issues that our members see on a daily basis within public schools, issues that school division leadership and trustees are trying to address across the province, sometimes with little or no support from the provincial government. One of the issues that's hugely impacted by this is standardized testing. And standardized testing has a critical role to play in any educational system. Standardized testing, and this comes from the OECD itself, who administers the well-known PISA tests, standardized testing exists to identify shortcomings system-wide in an educational system. And one of the shortcomings that PISA testing has identified within the province of Manitoba is the simple impact that poverty has on student outcomes. Ignoring this ignores improvement within the educational system. But Bill 64 will take standardized testing one step further. Bill 64 calls for standardized test results to be published on a school by school by school basis. We've seen this occur commonplace across jurisdictions in the United States. When it does occur, parents gravitate towards good schools, the ones with high test scores, and if they're able to, if they're not poor enough, they try to remove their children from those bad schools and move them into good schools. Bill 64 completely ignores and completely misuses standardized testing, not for the good of the system, but to try to disrupt and almost destroy the system. Bill 64 also regresses in critical aspects of our curriculum. For those who may not realize it, a curriculum is what a teacher uses to determine what needs to be taught at a grade level or a subject level. How a curriculum is delivered, how students are taught, that befalls a professional responsibility onto well-educated and well-prepared teachers. One of the very troubling aspects of Bill 64 is it allows parents to opt their children out of learning that is sensitive in nature. Bill 64 does not identify what sensitive topics are, but our experience across the province makes us believe that these sensitive topics are likely to surround issues like reconciliation, inclusivity, healthy education, substance abuse, among other things. All items that we would all agree are absolute necessities if we are going to prepare our young people for life ahead within our society. The most troubling aspect is actually reconciliation. We have a duty as Canadians. It flowed from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and very specifically recommendations from the TRC that addressed what needed to be done within public education in order to ensure our pathway forward in reconciliation. If Bill 64 is truly to modernize the education system, it should speak directly to reconciliation, but it doesn't. And I share the concern of Senator Murray Sinclair when he fears that reconciliation will simply be seen as an Indigenous issue. And for those schools that don't have a significant Indigenous population or an Indigenous population at all, reconciliation will not be seen as a priority in any way going forward. Bill 64 also obstructs free and fair collective bargaining. Now, this, you may think, is only an issue for those who work in the public school system. But in the province of Manitoba, quite a few decades ago, the teachers exchanged the right to strike and school divisions the right to lock out employees. They exchanged those for fair binding arbitration. And binding arbitration has served not only school divisions, has not only served teachers, but it has also served the parents in the province well for decades now. The key feature for the public in binding arbitration is binding arbitration ensures that if there's a labor dispute, our schools remain open. It ensures that teachers have access to active agreement, and it ensures that employers have the knowledge that arbitration will be a fair process in which their concerns and their voices will be heard. Bill 64 seeks to undermine fair arbitration by introducing the concept of ability to pay. And those of us with experience with ability to pay and a provincial government know that it is not so much ability to pay, but a willingness to pay. And this is a troubling trend that we have seen from this government in multiple pieces of legislation, where they are attempting to control the purse strings of the public sector through a so-called inability to pay, which is nothing more than a lack of desire to fairly compensate those who work in critical public services, including education. Bill 64 also threatens the collaboration and collegiality that currently exists within our schools, between teachers and between those who lead the schools. Our school leaders, our principal teachers and vice principal teachers. And I add the term teacher after principals in this term because that is the historical definition of principal. The principal, he, she, or they, is the principal teacher in the school, someone who brings vast experience to the table, vast knowledge to the table, and has a desire, not only a commitment, to share that experience among the entire staff of the school to the betterment of all in a school. Let me take you for a minute to a classroom, and I'm sure most of you have had the experience of a classroom, hopefully a public school classroom. You know through that experience that the best learning takes place when the relationship between student and teacher is a collegial and a respectful relationship. Well, a school is nothing more than a collection of classrooms. And if the relationship works well in a classroom, that same relationship will work well in a school, where a principal, teacher, and a teacher work collaboratively, collegially, and constructively together to bring about the best educational outcomes for students within the school. This has served our public education system well for near on 100 years. The desire to change this relationship comes purely from a business model where principals and vice principals are seen no more than managers of people, managers of infrastructure in a school. And we fear the beginnings of Bill 64 in terms of separating principal and vice principal from the bargaining unit the teachers lie in will be the beginnings of deprofessionalizing not only the teaching profession, but also deprofessionalizing the principals and vice principals and turning them in, unfortunately, to little more than school managers. So what can you do? Well, I can tell you already that you're doing the first one. You're sending letters. We know that from our experience, and I want to encourage you to continue to speak out and use your voices. I've been told that we've broached 300 registrants to speak at the committee level on Bill 64, and I'm thankful, chatting with my colleague Paul Wozney from Nova Scotia, that at least one of the things our government is still doing in this pandemic is they're still working through committees to hear the voices of our public. We need to hear your voices at committee level on this bill. If your voice isn't heard, we encourage you to write a written submission. Most importantly, though, we encourage you add to the conversation about Bill 64 and extend the conversation about Bill 64, because Bill 64 threatens all of our futures in this province by threatening the education and the educational future and the future of the young people who are attending our schools. So please use social media, use other platforms, keep the conversation going. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, particularly if you're an educator or former educator, because we know from experience that your voice is respected, your voice will be listened to. Lastly, I couldn't begin the time available to talk about everything contained in Bill 64. So for certain, if you want more information, please go to our website, mbteach.org. I would point you in the direction of the Manitoba Teacher in the most recent edition, which is devoted entirely to Bill 64. And some of that edition touches on the things that Manitoba's public educators told the K-12 Education Review, things that needed to be done to improve and to modernize the public education system in the province of Manitoba. Your help in spreading that news would be excellent. The last thing is I'm going to leave you with one final thought. Bill 64, the Education Modernization Act. Anyone who is familiar with the public school system in the province of Manitoba, and I dare say the public school system in any province across this great country of ours, knows that the work that has been going on in our public school system to modernize it, to adapt it to this pandemic, to work constructively, not only with one another in the system, but to work with our school leaders, to work with our divisional leaders, and to work with school trustees to continually deliver, but to modernize the delivery in the face of the pandemic, public education to our children. We've never seen modernization as the system has brought to you. We would call upon the government not to dismantle a system that has served so well this past year and so well for 100 years prior to this past year. Again, Molly, wonderful to have the opportunity to speak this evening.
Thank you so much, James Bedford from the Manitoba Teachers Society, for that overview and presentation. That was very informative and very helpful. And yeah, it's great to receive that presentation. I haven't had a chance to see it yet. And there's been some wonderful introductions in the chat and some comments. So to everybody out there watching, thanks so much again for being here and for participating in the chat. I just wanted to note two other elected officials that I noted who are here. We have Mark Wassaloo, who's the NDP finance critic, and also Mintu Sandhu, the MLA for the Maples. And if there's any other elected representatives who I've missed, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's now my pleasure to introduce all the way from Nova Scotia, James Bedford's counterpart, Mark Wozney, the president of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, to talk about the impacts of a very similar review on teachers and the education system in Nova Scotia. So thanks so much for being here. I know it's later in the evening over there for you, Paul, so thanks so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give this a whirl and see if I can share my screen. Before I do this, I just want everybody to know I'm sipping from my MTS authorized mug in solidarity with all my Manitoba teacher siblings. Let me see here. This is the one I want. And I hope everybody can see this. Here we go. So I want to talk a little bit about the impacts of the Glaze Report, which is the Nova Scotia version of your education review. And of course, Dr. Avis Glaze was the sole investigator and author of our report. And I believe, she was central to the process in Manitoba, although she played a less visible role. I know that there were elected people and bureaucrats who were the face of your procedure, but really she was the quarterback and sort of the shadow author of your report. The legislation in Nova Scotia that's similar to your Bill 64 is Bill 72, and it was it came into full effect in Nova Scotia in February of 2018. So we have the better part of 2.5 years of water under the bridge with Bill 72 as law. I think James has highlighted effectively, I will castigate your premier. He hasn't been shy to plagiarize terrible legislation from Nova Scotia. I believe Manitoba's Bill 148. Our Bill 148 is which bill for you, James? Is it Bill 148 as well?
No, they called it Bill 64, Paul.
Okay. So it was almost a carbon copy. They changed the names. I think they just changed Nova Scotia to Manitoba in that piece. And then this legislation pulls all kinds of parallels. So there are not a whole lot of distinctives, and I won't spend a lot of time on that. What I want to focus on is impacts of this legislation post proclamation. The first one I want to focus on is how diverse voices in Nova Scotia have been silenced in school governance. Historically, elected school boards, elected Anglophone school boards in Nova Scotia was the only level of elected government in Nova Scotia where there were designated fully equal seats for African Nova Scotian and Black community members and Indigenous members of the community. And this is, again, this is the only level of government in Nova Scotia where these voices are centered and empowered as equals. When elected Anglophone school boards were terminated, these voices were snuffed out. And both the Indigenous community in Nova Scotia and the African Nova Scotian and Black community struggled for decades to achieve representation at this level. So this was a major blow. I won't steal too much thunder here. Archie Beals from Nova Scotia can speak from a first voice perspective. He was one of the elected trustees in one of these roles that was shown the door. But nonetheless, suffice it to say that, part of this is systemically in Nova Scotia, our public education system has generationally failed Black and Indigenous students. The failure is not with the students. There's no achievement gap in the sense that kids have failed. Our system has failed Black and Indigenous kids for generations. And the voices that represented those children and those communities were cut out of the process. There is now an appointed body of which Archie is a member, and he can outline what that is. But really, equity is a political choice. It's not automatic. And a fundamental difference is that both the African Nova Scotian community and the Indigenous community in Nova Scotia no longer have autonomy over who represents them when it comes to matters of public education. So that's a big deal. The other piece I would point out is that public education in Nova Scotia, in terms of elected school boards, it was the only level of government where women made up more than 50%, or we were better than gender parity in terms of gender representation in electoral politics. And we have had a significant number of female politicians move on from school board trustee positions into municipal, provincial, and federal politics. It really became a proving ground for incredible, strong, principled female voices that made notable contributions at other levels of government. And when this was terminated, it really cut out an entry-level proving ground that was particularly of benefit to women in Nova Scotia. So this was a significant loss in terms of first voice perspectives that actually have decision-making power over policy and systemic administration and change. The second major change is that this resulted in a significant additional burden and workload for parents and teachers. When elected school board trustees were terminated and shown the door, we lost an incredible amount of institutional knowledge that benefited the community. It's a sort of hidden benefit of this level of governance. Public education bureaucracy is incredibly complex, and elected school boards as trustees really were sort of the gurus that understood who you needed to talk to get the right answer to the right question. Parents wouldn't know anything about this, but they could turn to their elected trustees and get sound advice based on years of experience with the system. When they were terminated, all those people were sidelined, and we turned to what we are now we've called school advisory councils. I know the Manitoba version has a slightly different moniker, but all of a sudden we went from people who had paid release time to do this work to parent volunteers that were kind of giving volunteer time and far less familiar with the school system as a whole. And now when there are parents who have concerns about policy or of a systemic nature, they're turning to parents that don't know anything about themselves and don't even know where to go to get the answers. And that falls back on teachers and principals. And so I have the angry mob here because very rarely when people have questions about the schools, are they positive questions or almost always frustrated or angry. Teachers on the call will identify with that. And now teachers are being forced to answer questions because the only people to answer these questions are either A, the Minister of Education, who's largely unavailable to parents, and school board bureaucrats. And these are the same people that would have been accountable and fireable by elected trustees. They've been handed the keys to the bureaucracy, and they commonly farm out answers to underlings that have no decision-making authority and simply parrot government talking points. And so both these school advisory councils and teachers really have been put in the crosshairs of conflict. And they increasingly are dealing with parents who are frustrated, who need help navigating the system, and are directing their anger and frustration at people who have no decision-making authority. And it's having an impact on the positive relationships. We know as a teachers union that healthy schools rely on a tripod. We need engaged parents, engaged students, and engaged school staff and support folks. And when you've taken a huge chunk out of that, when you change the dynamic between parents and teachers, where it's one of anger, distrust, and resentment, it complicates the day-to-day work of supporting students. And that's been to the detriment of our kids and our communities. The last thing I want to focus is on, in the neoliberal spirit, this was all supposed to result in significant cost savings. We're spending a lot of money, but we're not spending it wisely. And you can see here under Catalyst 6, this comes directly from Avis Glaze's report, that this was going to result in significant fiscal efficiencies. And really what it would mean is that we would have funds that we would have spent on sort of extra or redundant leadership or administration, and that money could be reinvested in classrooms. And I can report to you 2 years later in Nova Scotia, there is no extra money being funneled into the education budget. As a matter of fact, the department's provincial budget represents a modest increase year over year in its own staffing to deal with administrative bureaucracy. They're actually less efficient being the sole trustee of public education than they were when they were elected trustees that they had to deal with. The other thing I want to highlight here is this was supposed to save a lot of money. Elected trustees don't necessarily make a big salary, but they did in Nova Scotia earn a stipend. Archie might comment on that. I think it was in the neighborhood of $35,000 annually. And really that added up to about $1.5 to $1.8 million for all trustees across 8 different elected school boards in Nova Scotia. Well, one would think that that $1.8 million would be part of that money that could be reinvested in the classroom. Well, what they did with it instead was they took all of the schools in Nova Scotia, there's about 315 to 320, and they divided that $1.8 million into chunks of 5,000 plus a little bit extra based on population, and they turned it around and handed it to unaccountable parent volunteers and said, here, spend this on your school. And I've included here the calculation of the funding and also sort of the outlining for how you could spend the money. So it was supposed to support school improvement plans or policy development implementation or cover operational expenses, which is AKA metrage and communication for SAC members. Ultimately, we have seen this be a complete gong show. This money has been spent on school uniforms. It's been spent on field trips. It's been spent on expensive motivational speakers and guest speakers. It's been spent on school fairs and festivals. Very little of this money is actually spent for the purposes it's intended. And in schools that are not able to sustain parent involvement in a school advisory council, it becomes a discretionary fund for school principals who spend this money without oversight. So, on the whole, this report has become an ocean of unkept promises and unfulfilled commitments, and it has done absolutely nothing to enhance the quality of public education or student experience in the classroom. And it definitely has not translated into any additional resources or supports for teachers to remedy the longstanding concerns that exist with what kids need more of in our schools. So that's about what I can say. It's a major dud, and I can't urge all Manitobans on the call to mobilize strongly enough with your school board trustees, your teachers union, your local parents groups, to contact your MLAs and tell the Pallister government, this is not what we want for our kids. There's a better way. Don't pass this legislation, because once it comes, it forever changes the game, and it's a long fight. The only way to change these things is for a future government to rescind this legislation and install something else. And as soon as it becomes political and it's taken out of the hands of people with the control, it feels very much like a lost battle.
Thank you, Paul Wozney, the president of Nova Scotia Teachers Union, for that excellent overview and for lighting our fire here in Manitoba. We really appreciate that. And now I'm going to turn it right over to Archie Beals for his insights. Archie is a former elected African Nova Scotian representative of the Halifax Regional School Board and is currently an appointee to the Provincial Advisory Council on Education in Nova Scotia. So you've lived in both worlds, and we're very pleased that you're able to be with us this evening, Archie, to explain what it was like to serve as an elected school trustee and now in the new model. So yeah, over to you, Archie.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's a great honor. I just want to correct a figure that Paul gave. It wasn't 35,000. It was more like 15,000 a year that elected school boards were, the stipend for elected school boards. So it was about 15,000. So you can see it wasn't that those who did it for the money, because it wasn't that much. So as the African Nova Scotian rep on the Halifax Regional School Board, it was very, it was a challenging job because you were I was the rep and the voice for the community on the board. So I had to ensure that I listened to the voice of the community and make sure that those issues and views were known at the board level. It gave parents an avenue or someone to go to take issues to the board, which was lost when school boards were eliminated. The African Nova Scotian community was very disengaged and disenfranchised in the educational system. And with the elimination of boards, it became even more so. I still, 2 years after, a little more than 2 years after the elimination of boards, still get calls from parents who have issues and concerns. And because of contacts that I still have at the board level, I'm able to put parents in contact with people that they need to at the board level. But that piece from the community to the board level is missing. It's gone. It took us years to get to the table. And when we finally got to the table, that table was dismantled. So it created a big void in the community. I also sit on the Provincial Council on Education, Provincial Advisory Council on Education, which is the ministerial appointed committee, which advises the minister on issues of education. So, we meet, lately it's been virtual, but we meet probably 8 times a year. And, we go through, have presentations from various committees and stakeholders when it talks about inclusive education or the different issues that come up and reports that come up. So, and there's, I think there's about 15 of us on that board. There's also one representative from another ministerial appointed committee, the Council on African Canadian Education, which is a body that advises a minister on issues of educational issues from the African Nova Scotian community. That body came out of the BLAC report, which was introduced back in 1995, 94, 95. And it's an advisory committee Took 5 years to develop that report, and it was every African Nova Scotian community in the province was consulted. They did individual interviews, and actually I worked for the Black Learners Advisory Committee at the time as one of the regional educators who was responsible for developing that report. So it's a very comprehensive report looking at redressing educational inequalities of African Nova Scotians in the province. And I can say almost 30 years after the release of that report, all of the recommendations in that report are still not implemented. I've been asking for an updated report on the recommendations that have been implemented and those that have not, and those that are still being worked on. So I'm still waiting to get that report. And there is also a representative from the Mi'kmaq Council on Mi'kmaq Council on Education. So there's at least one person from each of the two designated groups on that committee. You know, it's not the same. And, you know, you apply to agency boards and commissions, and if you're appointed, you're appointed. So it's, you know, it's not that, and we don't work for or, you know, advocate on behalf of the community. It's more of an advisory council to the Minister of Education. But me being who I am, if issues come to me from the community, I bring those to the advisory committee. That's where we get answers. That's where the community needs to be. So that's it in a bit of a nutshell. And I'd be prepared to answer any questions that you may have at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Archie. That's all really important information, and it's so good to have you here with us tonight. And I know there's questions already for you, so we'll save those for the discussion question period. Thanks so much. I just wanted to note in the chat, there's two options. If you send it to panelists and attendees, that gets to everyone in the blue drop down. There are some notes that are just going to panelists, so but I think they're probably intended for everyone, so just to note that. I also want to take a little moment to acknowledge we also have John Gerard here from the Manitoba Liberal Party as another political representative, so I'm acknowledging you, John. Yeah, now we'll move along to Muna Kadri, who's a member of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, and she's going to talk very briefly about the history of changes in Ontario and the organizing strategy of Ontario Families for Public Education. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, Muna.
Thank you for having me. Hello from Toronto, Ontario. I've got some slides to share with you, and in 10 minutes, I'll take you through neoliberal attacks on public education in Ontario and what we've done to fight back. Clearly, I'm not going to be able to take you through all of it, and I'm going to skip many parts. But listening to a lot of what I've heard tonight, my God, they're plagiarists. And I think Paul said this. Everything that you're talking about, I feel like we've seen in Ontario. Lots of conservatives, lots of cuts, and I'm not going to use anything that's not PG-13 language, but lots of really bad ideas. And so a lot of the things that I'm hearing about tonight, I actually experienced as a student many years ago under the Mike Harris government. So I wasn't even an education worker at the time. I'm currently an education worker. I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 11 years, a high school teacher where I taught politics and history. For the last 4 years, I've been a union rep inside of an office in the city above Toronto in York Region. And I'm the parent of a 6-year-old who's in grade 1. His school happens to be in my backyard. And I emphasize that identity about all those things that I am, because often in education, we talk about the unions, the education workers, and the parents. And there's these separate groups. You have to do this and you have to do that. And what we've realized in the last year as organizers is we need to blur those lines. Those lines don't exist. We're all complicated and we've all got multiple identities. And once we start to breach those identities, we can actually start to fight back effectively. So these are the merry cast of characters that we have. Unfortunately, we're stuck with Doug Ford right now and Stephen Lecce, who's our Minister of Education, which I assume you're going to be seeing on a ballot for Prime Minister soon enough. So I've warned you about him. Be aware that he's coming for all of us. So where did this all start? And a lot of the things that you're talking about right now started with this terrible human being, Mike Harris, when he was Premier of Ontario when I was a high school student. And so the things that you're talking about, amalgamation, new funding models, taking taxing powers away from local municipalities, standardized testing, creation of the Ontario College of Teachers, introduction of teacher performance appraisals, elimination of grade 13, removal of principals and vice principals from bargaining units. And I'm going to send a message to my colleagues who are education workers. The chilling effect that that has on school buildings cannot be emphasized enough. It turns into an us versus them mentality versus a collegial happy mentality, and one that I've never experienced because I've always been in a system as an education worker where our principals and vice principals are not in the union, and I think about how wonderful it could be if they were still in it. But Mike Harris ended that. And he largely defunded adult education. So everything that you have spoken about tonight, this is the grandfather who decided to do this in Ontario and spread the misery around. Mike Harris isn't Premier anymore. Many years have passed, and I'm going to skip the in-between Liberal years, but in the in-between Liberal years, we had our right to collectively bargain challenged, and we had to go to the Supreme Court to fight to collectively bargain. And that decision has come out, and we won that decision. So I'm surprised that you're seeing the same situation there. And BC won when they fought back against that too. So I'm going to skip that, and I'm going to go to the Conservative government that we have right now because I have a limited amount of time. And Doug Ford, who's currently raining misery on us in Ontario, started as soon as he was elected to rain misery on public education. That was something that he had in his crosshairs from day one when he started. And so I want to highlight some of the changes that he brought in right away and how we fought back, because that's the goal tonight for me, to tell you how we fought back and how you can fight back successfully. So before Doug Ford took power in the secondary panel, we had a funded class average of 22-to-1 students. So for every 22 students, we were funded at one teacher. We had class caps negotiated locally in region by region. So what the North needed, the North had negotiated. What the South needed, the South had negotiated. E-learning was optional, fantastic. And then we had these things called local priorities funds. And these were really quite magical because unions and school boards came together to decide how to spend this money. And so it's something that education worker unions negotiated as a benefit for students in our schools, but we were able to come and collectively decide how to do it. One of the first things he did when we came to the bargaining table after he was elected was he radically changed how students were funded from 22-to-1 to 28-to-1. The big difference as well was e-learning. So they have a privatization goal here in Ontario, and that's largely to get students to take online credits through private institutions rather than have them delivered through public schools. And he brought in a plan to make students take 4 of those mandatory e-learning credits as a graduation requirement. And that local priorities fund, where we came together after we had bargained this $148 million, he took it away. And so it was a shot directly at us 2 months before bargaining started that had a chill on the bargaining table. How do you fight back against a government that is hell-bent on destroying public education, and you resist collectively, and you don't see it as parents need to fight back and we're going to fight back as the union? You see it as we as communities, and inside our communities, our education workers, our parents, our grandparents, our cousins, our EAs, our ECs, everybody, we are one community and we're going to collectively resist together. And that resistance really started even months before he actually made any of the cuts, through organizations like the Ontario Families for Public Education and the Ontario Parent Action Network. So I want to talk to you really quickly about what that resistance looked like and what we learned through that resistance. And it's a cycle is what we learned. And the first part of that cycle that you must start with is clear, rapid communication. And that needs to happen in advance of any of the cuts happening. So you need to establish clear communication lines with the public and your members so that if something bad happens, you are the trusted voice in public education. Authentic community connections and organizing are the next step. You can't look for friends when you need them. You have to be developing relationships both with your members, with your colleagues, and with your communities in an ongoing way so that when the rain comes, you've already got your umbrellas and you're ready to protect one another. And then lastly is action. Action gets the goods. You need to build capacity for action with the other 2 steps, but I'm going to go through that here. I'm here because I love all of my lefty friends, but every time I do these presentations, I say, dear lefty friends, we need to talk. One of the groups that I've spent a lot of time working with, Ontario Families for Public Education, is now the largest education advocacy group in all of Canada on social media. Largest. I think there are 82,000 people who are following it. They rival newspapers in terms of engagement and reach, and they only talk about public education. What is the winning formula for Ontario Families for Public Education? Simplicity. Again, I mean this in the kindest of ways, but most people have no idea what we're talking about as people who are heavily engaged in education, who've been doing this a long time, and who are highly motivated to participate in these discussions. I think back to my parents who came in as refugees. We all came in as new immigrants and refugees to this country. We had no idea what education policy was, how it impacted us. We needed people to break it down for us to engage with the system, and that never happened. And that's what Ontario Families does. And I show you some of the examples of the graphics that look kindergarten, but they take really, really complicated issues and break them down so that people slowly become education experts. And once families and parents feel like they can engage with these things, they can start to engage in that sort of dialogue and start to advocate for themselves like you've asked them to do at various times. And you have to be fast. That the person who speaks first gets to frame the issue. And it's hard to get people to back off of a specific framing once someone else has convinced them. So something else that these education groups are doing is rapid response. The minute the Minister of Education speaks, or there's new legislation, or the Premier speaks, there's a response within an hour to give you some contextualizing of what they said. And that's what this is, be the trusted voice. So a lot of the times unions were guilty of being political all the time. So every ad is an attack ad. Every ad is a call to arms. Just educate sometimes. So something that they do is they summarize press conferences, and they don't actually editorialize. They just say, well, this is what was said. And then they put out information just explaining basic terms like what's a class average and what's a class cap. People start to engage with that information, and they start to trust that source so that when the political information comes out and when the attack ads come out, there's already this trusted relationship, and they don't presume that all of your information is biased. And so depoliticize to politicize is what my advice would be there. Next, this is the community connections, find friends who like trouble. And so two groups, again, that I'm going to give a heavy push for is Ontario Parent Action Network. And if you're on Twitter and you go to @ParentAction4Ed, the action in their name really represents what they do. They organize to act in Ontario to protect public education. And then on Facebook, Ontario Families for Public Education is more the informing and educating side of the advocacy. They work together. So there's one group for people who really just want to keep informed and want to engage in some sort of digital activism. And then there's another group who's ready to take it to the streets, like they did even before bargaining started with things called walk-ins. The Ontario Parent Action Network organized what they called walk-ins, where they had parents walk in with teachers one day for school to show and demonstrate solidarity across the province in terms of their resolve for public education. Bargaining hadn't happened yet. The fight hadn't really gone yet, but they decided that they wanted to demonstrate as a sign of force that parents and unions were going to walk hand in hand together. Now, unions, there's a role to play for you here, because sometimes we say it's up to parents to go do that organizing. What the Ontario Families for Public Education did, and you'll see examples of, is that's Harvey Bischoff, the president of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, being interviewed by a parent on Facebook Live. That's Laura Walton, the president of the OSBCU for CUPE, being interviewed by a parent on Facebook Live. So the Minister of Education would go out and say all these terrible things about union leaders, and union leaders would go on Facebook and take questions from thousands of parents across the country on Facebook Live to say, I'm not afraid to answer your questions. You can bring them to us. We are one and the same. And on the right, you'll see another tactic we used. When you get to bargaining, we brought parents to the bargaining table. So the Minister of Education wouldn't engage in good faith bargaining or show up to the bargaining table. Parents wanted the bargaining table to move. So we said, we put out a call out, let's all go out to the bargaining table. And, one night, late at night, we had Harvey out there and it was dark, and it's a great video if you go on Ontario Families for Public Education of him standing there talking to a few hundred parents about how he was going to go upstairs and fight for their kids when the Minister of Education wouldn't even show up. And just the visual of that families and unions are walking together to protect our schools. I mean, I can't explain to you how magical the moment was. The last thing in that sort of trifecta, so you've done the educating, you've broken it down in the simplest of terms, and you found a way to make people sort of engage with it. I mean, we're teachers, we teach physics, we teach reading, we teach writing, we can break down education policy. The last is action. Nothing will ever replace workers withdrawing their labor. That is the most effective way to actually achieve change. And what we did in Ontario is all of that parent organizing, all of that educating made strikes acceptable to the public. We had rotating strikes for almost a year in Ontario until COVID actually hit, and the public largely supported us. We had press conferences of 4 or 5 parents on a panel saying, we support the education workers walking out, and we don't support the Minister of Education, which was so incredibly powerful because we had done all that organizing. And if you're not part of a labor organization, you can walk out and withdraw your power. We created space for people to be activists at wherever they were in terms of their journey. So maybe it's a phone call to an MPP, maybe it's a Twitter storm, maybe it's an email campaign, but we equipped everyone to participate on their own terms, and we didn't judge the way they participated. So everyone felt like they were part of the fight. And what did that result in? So let's look back at that chart that I showed you at the beginning. We had that 22-to-1 funded class average. He proposed 28-to-1. We ended up at 23-to-1. So we had this conservative government that was hell-bent on destroying public education. And we, inch by inch, through the work from the federations, the work from the education workers, and the work from community organizing, we pushed back. And really why we had to go to the bargaining table and settle is COVID hit. Literally, as we were, I think it was a few days before we were on a picket line at Queen's Park, COVID hit and sort of slowed us down. In terms of mandatory e-learning, we went from 4 mandatory credits to 2 mandatory credits. And we won that local priorities fund, but they renamed it and took a lot of the decision-making powers away from the unions at the table collaboratively with the actual school boards. But to think that we had a conservative government that in past years you could not bargain with, you could not bring away from the brink, and we pushed them and we actually took away a lot of what they were trying to do, that's huge success. And so in all of your struggles, my message to you today is you can organize to win. You just have to invest in that sort of collaborative relationship between communities and education workers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Muna. That was amazing. Congratulations to you and those that you're working with. It's just so exciting, and to share your experience with us. That's fantastic. There's been a very active chat while you've been talking. I think people are feeling inspired. So thanks so much for sharing that with us here tonight. And our final panelist is Medina Musa, who's the Executive Director of Support Our Students, SOS Alberta, and she is going to be talking about what's happening in Alberta and what SOS is doing there. So you're in Calgary, is that right, Medina?
Yes, I am.
Over to you.
I'm just going to share my screen with everybody. Thank you so much for having SOS here. I'm very honored to be part of this panel tonight. I'm just going to take you through how I'm going to spend the next few minutes of your time. Just a quick introduction, and then a few minutes about what the path to privatization looks like, and a few more minutes illustrating how Alberta has followed that path. I would argue we are winning the race to the bottom. Unfortunately, we are almost there. And mostly what I want to share with you is how Support Our Students Alberta has responded and mobilized against these attacks on public education, and how these lessons learned can benefit Manitoba in this struggle. So let's see here we go. So my name's Medina Musa. I am the mother of 4 kids. I have an entrepreneurial background and a marketing background. I am not an educator. And I came to this as a volunteer, actually. So Support Our Students was founded in 2015 on the playgrounds of Calgary schools, first by parents and then joined by citizens with varied professional and cultural backgrounds. And they were concerned about chronic underfunding and the increasingly fragmented education system that we have today in Alberta. SOS volunteers work tirelessly to inform citizens how the undermining of public education is part of a larger neoliberal movement to privatize our education system. And I'm hearing tonight that this is not unique to Alberta. by any stretch, but it was unfortunately happened here first in 1993, but we'll get to that. So the path to privatization. The first step to privatize a public institution is to tear down what exists. This is done by creating distrust for the institution and those who operate it, such as criticism of how school boards are run and the effectiveness of trustees and superintendents and teachers for that matter. Then we often see doubt cast on the outcomes of students. Politicians may talk about how the system is failing, how students are falling behind, really exploiting parental fears about their children's future success. For example, in Alberta, the government's currently claiming that we're at the bottom and we've dropped in all of our PISA scores, when in fact, we're actually maintaining one of the top positions. So it's a blatant lie, in fact, is what it is. And they do this, and this is an effort by governments to undermine the system and to cast doubt on its effectiveness. And then there's effect to the funding model. So chronic underfunding and shifts in funding models become commonplace and makes tracking cuts less transparent. It plays out like a game of smoke and mirrors that the average citizen does not have time to fully analyze the impact of those cuts. Just like Munu was talking about simplifying that information and having it more repetitive, that is something that SOS has become an invaluable source for Albertan families here. Chronic underfunding really translates into excessive fundraising for parents. Fundraising for school libraries, math manipulatives, playgrounds, lunch tables so kids aren't eating on the floor. That's when you know your education system has been chronically underfunded, is that parents are fundraising for what the government should be responsible for and should be paying for with the money that is invested and entrusted to them. Next path is the next point on the path, choice. Choice has become part of the Alberta lexicon, whether we're talking about cars or schools. The concept of choice is used to elevate individualism over collective obligation to provide public schools for the common good. School choice has had its intended alluring effect by neoliberals, to shift the mindset of people to begin to see education as a commodity instead of a public institution. Choice is at the core of the charter school movement. Oops, pardon me. Okay. What am I talking about next? This enticing idea of choice brings with it a plethora of alternative programs. As students are separated, be it by subjects like art or science, by pedagogy like traditional learning or self-directed studies, or by religion, there is a dividing of people, a fragmenting of communities based on our differences, instead of a bringing together with our commonalities to build respect for one another's diversity. And this division, this being comfortable in separate silos, existing in the same place without interacting, is a pluralistic approach. And quite frankly, it is an affront to the long-standing Canadian values of inclusion and multiculturalism. And you'll see it in neoliberal speak. We see it here in Alberta right now in the redevelopment of our curriculum, and I'm going to get to that soon. But the result of the sum of all of these steps, the individual is elevated over the collective, and the universality of the system breaks. Without universal public education, we risk losing the most powerful tool to achieve some level of equity within our society, and will, in turn, erode our democratic system. And I talk about that because it's what we're fighting for. So I think it's really important when you're mobilizing and organizing to understand what's at stake and why it matters. Next, I want to talk about decoding neoliberal Eduspeak. So on your screen, you're going to see a bunch of words that maybe you've heard repeated. I know in Alberta, it's become part and parcel of the vocabulary used when talking about education. Specific language, it matters. This is reformer language. the word autonomous, used to empower parents to drive a highly localized education policy. That's exactly what's happening in Manitoba. Words like choice, families may choose to apply to a school, but ultimately it's the school choice, it's the school's choice who allows for exclusivity once we're in a privatized system. So parental rights, we've talked about this evening as well, allowing for an opt-out clause. Back to basics, it's a rally cry for rote memorization and really a dig at teachers, trying to take away that craft. And likely, similar to what we're going to be talking about with the curriculum draft, a call for more standardized tests. So, and competition. So we're talking about changing education into a business. Funding will be tied to outcomes in competition. In a decentralized system, schools will fight over scarce education dollars and reward systems. It ups the ante. It's a survival of the fittest mentality. And in education, there should not be winners, there should not be losers. There should be an abundance, and each student should have the support to reach their full potential. Oops, wrong way. So what we've learned at SOS is that there are these inflection points. And at these inflection points, it drives citizen engagement. And that's what we are. We aren't just a group of parents, we are a group of citizens, because public education is a citizen issue. And Muna talked about this, the mobilization of the collective, not keeping us all in our separate groups of teachers, non-parents, non-educators, non-government. It is all of us. We all benefit from public goods, and we all have to stand up together and fight for them. So maybe some of you are familiar with the Klein Era in Alberta, started in 1993. That is when significant cuts came to Alberta. I think it was the start of privatization in all of Canada. There was also amalgamation of school boards, I think 170 something down to 61. And it actually also limited the school board's ability to collect taxes. And that became a centralized power into the province. And the big change in Alberta was funding follows the student. Alberta has a voucher system. So if your child goes to a private school, 70% of that funding follows them to that accredited private school, no matter whether they charge $5,000 tuition or $25,000 tuition. And it was also in '94, the introduction of charter schools, which are 100% publicly funded, but privately delivered. And when I'm listening to the explanation of what's happening in Manitoba and the decentralization of power, what you're essentially going to end up with is an entire system of charter schools, each fighting for their own school, their own kid, and it highlights this individualism, and it breaks the collective and it breaks the universality. It is actually a much more expeditious path to charter schools than Alberta has had. In fact, Alberta, after these Klein introduced charter schools in '93, there was actually a cap, and it was sold as this idea of innovation. And these little hotbeds of innovation were going to feed back to the public system, and as a result, it was going to get better and better, and it was going to be a very modern approach. But that never happened. And there was a cap on charters. There was only allowed to have 15 schools, charters. But what happened over 20 years is those schools have multiple campuses. And I think we're up to over 30 schools now. And we've got schools that are fighting for public dollars, right? So it's an unfair system. It's inequitable. The kids who go to private schools or charter schools are often the most advantaged to begin with. And that we're dealing with an increase in inequities. I could go on forever about what Klein did, but I'll spare us. I think between the Harris years and the Klein years, we've got that nightmare covered. Let's see. So we'll fast forward to 2019, right now, Kenny government, the UCP gets elected. We are welcomed with more cuts to education, new punitive funding models, threats to school boards. I think the minister said, we are gonna, I have a big hammer, I can always use it. Further defunding of organizations. There was a parent voice group that is funded by the government, and by 87%, that parent voice said, we do not accept that charter schools are public schools. What happened to that organization? They lost 70% of their funding within a week for speaking out. And then we've got the Education Act and choice. So here's this alluring idea of choice. Now it's been put into our Education Act, and it's a Trojan horse. People feel like they're getting something special, but what it really does is it divides and it breaks universality, and you've got parents and schools fighting over scarce resources. So enter SOS. Actually, SOS started in 2015, and they had built this incredible foundation, and they had spent an enormous amount of time informing and engaging the public. They used a documentary called Backpack Full of Cash. And follow us. I hope we'll show another watch party soon. I think Ontario's actually showing it now. We started letter writing campaigns, protests. They've launched citizen toolkits, workshops. So they knew what was coming. SOS, and I talk about they because I wasn't part of SOS then. I am a product of the work that these volunteers did. I was engaged by the work they were doing. I recognized the need. I have 4 kids, like I said, in school. I'm surprised you haven't heard them. And I'm seeing how the system is being starved, and I'm seeing how it's being broken. So enter the pandemic. What has happened with the pandemic is it's made, as everyone has spoken about this evening, it has really shown the inequities within our society, but it's also given the government an opportunity, because they're using this crisis to create more chaos. And when this pandemic hit in Alberta, this government did not give any money to support schools. What they did is they laid off education workers. We had layoffs. They decided to take advantage of the federal government policies for their accounting, to save money, right? To offload it to other systems. And they gave us a couple masks and a squirt of hand sanitizer. There was no investment. The only investment Alberta got was from the federal funding. So what SOS did, this is actually what's really incredible, is first we started a coalition with doctors and educators, and we put forward a strategy for safer schools. And from that, and was a lot of media coverage, a lot of engagement, and we recognized how much engagement, and we also recognized that the government wasn't going to do anything. There was no plan, and there was a real failure to act. And they weren't going to track how COVID was going to unfold in this unsafe environment. So Support Our Students started the COVID tracker. And it's really an example of communities coming together to engage together. It can't happen. We provide the service, but it's citizens who are providing the information by submitting their letters from AHS and from their schools. It's teachers, it's everybody working together to provide a government service that is actually provided by volunteers in the public. And it's been a real point of engagement, and it's allowed for a discussing and a focusing on the issues, and to recognize that there's so much at stake here. And now in Alberta, we are dealing with the curriculum rewrite. So this is also very typical of neoliberalism, to attack what they're teaching. So they've politicized the process. The actual curriculum, it's racist, it's Eurocentric, it's completely age inappropriate. It focuses on intense content, and it really is meant to break teachers as much as it is to break our identity. It's a shift. It's an attempt to shift our Canadian values. And parents have activated on this in Alberta more than any other issue. And I think it's hitting nonpartisan lines as well. And what we've done to mobilize is we've launched a new website, Students Deserve Better, and there's letter writing campaigns. We've launched a lawn sign campaign, which is actually a huge undertaking for a fully volunteer run, unsourced, we were not funded organization, and we're building a network across this province. School boards, this is really interesting because school boards have not actually been eliminated here in Alberta. And we're seeing them activate on this issue. 34 out of 61 school boards, despite the intimidation by government, are actually standing up against the UCP and refusing to pilot this. They only have time to really stand up until the curriculum becomes the curriculum and is no longer a draft. But what SOS is trying to do is support that effort to show these school boards that the public, that citizens are with them. And of course, we're using social media and op-eds and traditional media all along the way. But I think it's a really good example of how important that level of government is. So,
Tina, thank you so much for this presentation.
Is it too long?
This is fantastic. Well, you know, we're getting up at our time here, and no, it's all really important, valuable information. But I think we probably didn't plan enough time for this event because you've all got such wonderful lessons and knowledge to share. Is there anything you want to wrap up with in particular, or I don't want to cut you off so abruptly?
I just went on the wrong screen. No, that's fine. Am I still on share screen? Can you guys see?
Yeah.
Is this? I'm all messed up here. Well, really, can you stop here? I'll just stop share. Really, what I want to wrap up with is what I've learned in this process, and it's that we cannot depend on anybody to help us, and we really have to help ourselves. And hopefully we can come together to do that. But it's citizens. Citizens have to engage. You cannot just depend on the teachers. You can't just depend on federal government or the next elected government. You have to be your own voice and your own heroes.
That's great. Thank you. That's wonderful. Well, I'm hoping people don't mind if we stay for about 10-15 minutes more, because we do have some questions for folks. I know it's very late over in Nova Scotia, so we'll be eternally grateful to you, Paul and Archie in particular. But yeah, I'm going to turn over to Erika now, and she's has some questions and compiling them with the questions that we've been getting from the chat. So yeah, Erika, do you want to start with a couple of questions?
I'm going to do my absolute best to try and consolidate and touch on as many issues as possible and hear from all the panelists who it's just been so fantastic to meet those of you I don't know, and to be in this opportunity, this virtual room with those of you I do as well. So thanks so much. That was fantastic. I'm going to start with a question for Archie. This is from Annette. Even with all, this is speaking, I'm repeating Annette's question. Even with all my experience, I would not feel comfortable having to be responsible for evaluating teachers or other staff who are not my current profession. How does this government expect the average parent to be able to do this in any meaningful way? So how are we supposed to recruit parents to serve on these new councils with much more responsibility? Archie, I'm wondering if you can say a few words about your experience.
Mm-hmm. We've had an abundance of applicants from parents to serve on the Provincial Advisory Council on Education. More than, I think they had like 150 applicants for 15 seats on the council. So there was a great interest in Nova Scotia for parents sitting on the advisory council. And it's not a governing board, it's an advisory board to the minister. So, there was great interest from parents and from, residents in Nova Scotia to serve on that council. I don't know if I answered that question or not.
No, that's helpful. And I think Paul's also raised his hand. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is kind of aimed at the local school bodies more so than the provincial body.
Yeah.
Here in Nova Scotia, the school advisory councils they're advisory. They're not operational councils. They're not intended to replace sort of the answerable to function of elected school boards. Under elected school boards in Nova Scotia, staffing decisions ultimately were the call of the elected trustees, even though that typically was the purview of staff. If we ever came to layoffs in Nova Scotia, we actually had language in our collective agreement that let teachers actually appear in person and plead for their jobs before the elected school board trustees. And that happened more than once. The idea of evaluating, if that's what your school-based councils are doing, I mean, our school advisory councils don't have that scope of authority, but we already have a hard time recruiting and sustaining parent volunteers, especially at rural schools. Like we have consolidated schools in many places in rural Nova Scotia where you drop a pin in a map and you drive for an hour and a half in all directions, north, south, east, west. And a lot of those communities are communities where people are precariously employed, seasonally employed, or work multiple minimum wage jobs. And they're simply not able to devote time or energy because it means missing a shift and putting my family in harm's way. So really what we have is kind of a tale of in communities where parents are better off or more stable in their income, they're more affluent, they're able to sustain engagement. And in communities where families are at greater risk, and Nova Scotia has the largest proportion of wage earners who live on minimum wage of any province of Nova Scotia. It's sort of a perfect storm. The working poor are really the parents that need to be most engaged. Those are the communities where there's the most oversight needed and engagement from parents, and they're the least capable because of their socioeconomic status of sustaining that engagement. So there definitely is a recruitment and retention issue at the local school. I'm not sure what the Manitoba version is called. I keep saying SAC, School Advisory Council, because that's what they're called here in Nova Scotia. But yeah, there are real problems with sustaining parental engagement. And I can only imagine if parents at school councils in Nova Scotia were saddled with, you've got to decide whether to fire a principal or fire a teacher, lots of people would be heading for the door.
Yeah, and I think they've had some difficulty attracting parents to serve on the school advisory councils as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, both of you. James, this is for you. It's from Celeste. This is a question about representation for French immersion schools within these divisions, and will the representatives be required to speak French? Or could you speak to that issue of representation or potentially lack of representation as you see it?
Well, thanks, Erika. I think, Celeste, it's what Erika last said is probably the lack of representation. If you think that within a region, within a province, and think of the diversity of the North or 100,000 students in the city of Winnipeg, there'll be a single individual selected to sit on a provincial advisory board. I would not expect that individual to come anywhere close to representing the diversity of any region within the province. So an immersion parent would be competing with, and you can make the list, I think, as long as you want, but competing with many, many other voices to ensure representation. This wouldn't be true, of course, for the Division Scolaire Franco-Manitobaine, which French language education there is protected under the Constitution, but no such protection exists for our wonderful immersion system that runs across the province.
Thank you, James. Paul, I'm going to kick this back to you. It's a question from Gayleen. Could you just say a few words about what happened as a result of removing principals from the NSTU?
Yeah, I think I answered a little piece of this. I think, in terms of the teacher, principals in Nova Scotia, we actually got harsher treatment under the law than Manitoba principals are getting. From my understanding, Manitoba's principals are not being legally defined redefined as management. the legislation still treats them as principal teachers. It just takes them out of MTS. And then I think they actually have the ability to reorganize potentially with MTS if they wanted to. In Nova Scotia, they actually legally changed how principals were defined in the legislation, like the fundamental underpinnings of schools. So principals in Nova Scotia are no longer principal teachers in the law, they're management. And so you can't legally redefine the scope of someone's role and it not have a profound, prolonged impact on sort of the function and the impact of that person in the system. And we advocated very strongly, you know, we're fundamental proponents of the collegial model. We believe that teachers and principals together share the duty of educating students. So while a principal operates in a leadership role, may not work full-time in the classroom, is no less a teacher. And really their job is to support the learning of all students and all teachers to teach students. By redefining them and pulling them out of the union, they were forced into a choice. Principals in Nova Scotia have the right to vote every 2 years to maintain legal affiliation with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union. And all that really means is they get to remain members of our pension plan, get all the same benefits that teachers get, and all that kind of stuff, and access to professional development funding that's provided by the province. So it's kind of in their self-interest to not vote to secede from legal affiliation. But we've already seen that principals, especially during the pandemic, when directives come particularly from school boards run by bureaucrats now, not by elected human beings, they're in a position, because they're not unionized and they're no longer protected by a collective agreement, they no longer have a right to grieve. There's no just cause standard for terminating principals. So if a principal decides I'm going to kick back or push back against a policy or direction that I think is not good for my students and my community, you do so at your own peril. And we've had a lot of principals, of very seasoned principals, either retire because they were eligible, they would have worked longer, or they've gone back to the classroom. And we've seen a dramatic impact on the willingness of teachers who are unionized to leave their teaching positions to seek school leadership roles that are not unionized and subject to arbitrary termination. And the only recourse that principals have now in terms of protecting their interest is to sue the school board for financial damages. And even if they win, all they're really entitled to is a financial settlement. They won't get their job back. So it's really changed how safe principals feel to leave their school. It's changed the bar. They've had to lower the bar, the requirements. You used to have to be a successful teacher with at least 5 years experience. You had to have a master's degree in education or related field completed, and you had to complete a leadership development program provided by the employer. So many people dropped out of leadership development programs to become principals when the legislation came in, that they've lowered the bar. You only now have to have 2 years of teaching experience. You have to be enrolled in a graduate program. You don't have to have completed advanced training. And you have to be willing to complete a leadership development program, not necessarily have completed it before you start. So the bar in terms of what it means to be a principal in Nova Scotia, in terms of, you know, that's kind of a quality control measure. Are you letting just anybody in the door? Or are you getting the best of the best? So we've already seen real change in terms of the quality of people willing to leave the safety of their union positions. And that's good. And we've already seen principals kind of trucked out of one part of the province because they're not unionized anymore. Seniority doesn't matter for them. They can get turfed in one place and then shunted off to another part of the province. So there are already some very significant impacts in what it's like to be a principal in Nova Scotia, and also some growing gaps between teachers feeling like principals represent the employer, not necessarily stand up for teachers at the school level.
Thanks, Paul. That was extremely helpful. I actually had a question for both Muna and Medina, and luckily someone just posted in the chat as well. So I'm going to ask it of both of you, and maybe Muna, you could start. Would we be well advised to focus on a single rallying cry that many different groups could stand up for in a unified way? Or is it better when individual groups choose their own issue of concern with the bill and lobby in their own specific way? And that is from Rob. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that just in your own context and from your own experience in Ontario and Alberta.
So homogeneous organizing is difficult, especially in grassroots contexts. It's hard to get a lot of people to agree into one thing. And so that's partly why you see the Ontario Families for Public Education and the Ontario Parent Action Network. So two separate groups who agree on a ton of stuff, who do a lot of stuff together, but are separate groups because sometimes the tactics can be different. So what I would suggest is to try to come together as one group. We've done that on many occasions, but in the cases where you have groups that say, you know, this is something I feel strongly about and we really need to advocate for this, and you can't get mutual agreement, you say to them, you might have to walk alone on this one, but we promise that we'll come back together and walk together on other issues. So try to do it collectively, but don't lose sleep about that. And I'm just going to tell you from the early days of the parent organizing, we lost sleep at many times about different groups coming up across the province who had different goals, and we tried to negotiate about how we would be one group or this, and then we realized that that wasn't. It was just important that we agreed to support each other in terms of our goals for protecting public education, and that we wouldn't always agree. So either or really works. Don't lose sleep about being one mega group that always agrees.
Oh, thanks, Muna. Medina.
Yeah, you know, SOS is in a pretty highly conservative landscape here in Alberta. So we have tried to be collective in our voice because we need that kind of energy. We need that many people. And we've been able to pull together on many, many issues. But definitely we're cherry picking when people want to get louder. And I think that's why this curriculum rewrite has engaged so much action from citizens, is because it is engaging across a lot of landscapes. But, you know, I like the idea of allowing people to engage on their own terms and giving them tools, giving them that service and the ability to make that accessible to them. And days of action that encompass many, many issues is more successful here in Alberta, we found.
Erika, can I jump in to answer one question that I cheated and I saw? People asked, well, how are you funding and how are people doing this? I call it the after bedtime revolution. So I can't speak for Ontario Parent Action Network, but with Ontario Families, it's moms with laptops after hours. There's no outside money that's funding this. It's literally moms who got together in a mom group one day 2 years ago, and we're like, what's going on in education in Ontario? And so if you think that these are large organizations with big donors, with people who are like highly polished, no, it's just moms working between their work, dinners, and kids and things like that. At least it is for those groups.
Thank you, Muna. I want to thank you all. This was, I mean, I wish we had more time to talk, and maybe we'll have more time for this in the future, but this has been fantastic. And I'm going to turn this back over to my wonderful colleague, Molly McCracken. And Molly, thanks so much for including me. This has just been a fantastic evening.
Thank you, Erika, and thank you everyone who's been involved tonight, all of our panelists, Erika Shaker, Adman, our tech support, our event sponsors, and all of you who've been here this evening and for sticking with us past our designated time. It's been just so important to get some information out there, to share information and get inspired, and I feel very inspired right now myself. And here at CCPA, I feel so privileged and honored to be able to do this work. And I really thank all the panelists for stepping up and saying yes so easily. And so we're so lucky to be able to create these spaces. And we see many CCPA supporters here in the audience here tonight. If you're not already a supporter of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we are Canada's leading progressive research institute. We're independent, charitable, and we value your support. We produce research that affirms that our best values are possible, and it gives permission and space to hope and to take care of each other like we know that we can in this territory, these territories on Turtle Island here and here in Canada. And one of the central tenets of our work has been progressive education, research, and policy. And we're just so lucky that Erika could be here tonight as the editor of Our Schools Ourselves. And if you donate to CCPA at least $35 a year, you will get the Monitor magazine. And twice a year, the Monitor includes the insert, which is Our Schools Ourselves, which is a great resource. And some of our panelists have been published in there. And I'm sure you'll be seeing more about a lot of the topics we talked about here tonight in Our Schools Ourselves. So that's our pitch to you. Every little bit matters. We do offer a charitable tax receipt, and we value your support, whatever you're able to provide now or in the future. So that's at policyalternatives.ca/give that you can donate to CCPA. So thank you so much. We will send an email tomorrow with a wrap up and a link to this event that's archived on our YouTube channel for you to share with others. And yes, please share it. A big thank you to all our panelists for spending time with us so readily tonight, and particularly the folks, and I seem to be very worried about you getting to bed on time or something. It must be the mom and me. But to folks on the east side of the country, I hope you have a good rest, and folks all over as well. Stay safe, everyone, and hopefully be in touch with you soon. Thanks, everybody, for your time.